fascinated by Damien Chazelle's career from a cinematography perspective. It's very interesting how directors choose to work with and subsequently choose not to work with different cinematographers. Looking through the filmography of Chazelle, he has worked with a handful of DPs, including himself. Chazelle's feature debut, Guy and Madeline on a Park Bench, was partially his senior thesis film, as he was finishing his bachelor's at Harvard. Chazelle shot this film on black and white 16mm film. Side note, for the life of me, I could not find what specific film stock he shot on, so I'm sorry. But the important thing to note here is Chazelle could have much more easily and inexpensively shot this film digitally, but he chose to spend the money to shoot on film, a choice he wouldn't replicate until the making of La La Land. Speaking of La La Land, Guy and Madeline has the feel of La La Land. It's got the same soul present, but then it's shot entirely differently. It absolutely draws from the French New Wave style of filmmaking, quote-unquote stealing shots in public, taking advantage of people going about their day in the background of shots, and just making things happen with what you have. But what's fascinating is to do this style of filmmaking with a musical. It's so different from what has come before, and I really think it set Chazelle apart really early in his career. I think it's important to mention that this is Chazelle and Justin Hurwitz's first collaboration as a director-composer duo. I just think it's so important to mention because the music of this film and the rest of his films play such an important role in his style and his voice as a director. And there are also some lovely musical motifs that span between this film and La La Land. And I think that's just such a lovely little touch. Additionally, G&M being shot on Super 16 adds a level of timelessness to a quote-unquote student film. Super 16 is a format that Chazelle won't revisit until First Man, way later in his career. The whole feeling of this film, though, is so different than the rest of his filmography. There's an almost observational doc-like feeling to a lot of the shots. Being on pretty long lenses with crazy crash zooms happening seemingly at random moments, I think really contributes to that feel, but it all comes together really well and is very different from what he will go on to do later in his career. Moving on to the Whiplash short, shot by Ed Lucas, a DP known for Nancy Drew and The Hidden Staircase, among others. Lucas has 47 IMDb credits since the Whiplash short. I think the look of the short is really interesting. Knowing it was supposed to be a proof of concept sort of lays a veil over the whole thing. There are many technical, quote-unquote, mistakes, but I find them honestly endearing and relatable. This being Chazelle's first real adventure into color filmmaking, I find it very fascinating, given the distinct look of the Whiplash feature. More on that later, of course, but first, I really want to look at the camera moves in the Whiplash short. The whole thing is a real performance between the camera and actors. It all feels very intentional, like the movement in Chazelle's features. Look at this specific move. Obviously, it screams little camera on a gimbal, but the idea is there, right? The whole purpose of this short was to prove the idea of Whiplash. Obviously, it worked, as less than a year later, the feature version was released. Okay, Whiplash, the major motion picture, was shot by Sharon Meir, who has 17 IMDb credits post-Whiplash. Okay, obviously IMDb credits have nothing to do with how good a cinematographer is, but I think it's a really interesting metric to measure things by. It sort of measures quantity of work other than commercials and other non-creditable work that a cinematographer can do. At a glance, you can look at someone's entire career. It's sort of beautiful and awful all wrapped up in one package. Knowing how much work goes into every single project, even the bad ones, really puts into perspective all these lines on somebody's IMDb page. Hey, getting back on topic, the color of the feature film version of Whiplash is so distinctly different than the short. There are a lot of other videos talking about this, some which I sort of disagree with. It is a very warm film, to be fair, but I think it sort of works. When Neiman is new to the band, the space doesn't yet feel aggressive. The whole room is actually sort of welcoming. It's drawing him in. It will soon lose this appeal when Fletcher is revealed to be a maniac, but it works. I'd also like to talk a little about the meticulous framing of Whiplash. It's also thoughtful throughout the film. Because of the nature of parts of songs needing to line up depending on the shot, it all needed to be meticulously planned. Compositionally, Chazelle and Meir did such a spectacular job of establishing power dynamics between Fletcher and Neiman, making Fletcher feel powerful throughout most, while making Neiman feel small and insignificant. We also see really impressive moments throughout this film. The bones of these movements were absolutely present in the short, but having money and crew certainly helps to accomplish them in a more smooth and polished way. Just having the crew and budget for something like a dolly opens so many creative doors. Fair warning, I'm going to go on a little tangent specifically about Fisher dollies, which is not what they used in Whiplash. I believe they used a Chapman. But the first time I wheeled a Fisher dolly around, I was mind blown. It's like a tripod, right? That can just achieve any camera move effortlessly. Obviously not effortlessly, like dolly grips work so hard and they're so good at what they do, but relatively effortlessly compared to how I kind of figured things out while I was learning, and I'm still obviously learning, but it's just crazy. Like, you turn a little dial and you get a perfect pedestal move. Looking at this BTS image from Whiplash, it looks like it's definitely a Chapman Peewee rather than a Fisher. They're functionally the same tool. I've never personally used a Peewee dolly, so I can't really comment on the differences. Production of Whiplash only took 19 days, which is essentially half of what a lot of similar features take. This is an aggressive schedule, to say the least, but they still needed to achieve the same level of shots as they would with double that amount of time. Continuing on the thought of color in his films, La La Land is a masterclass in color theory. There are countless videos and written essays that discuss this at great length, but observing the color throughout La La Land, Chazelle, he cooked. This was also the first of several collaborations between Chazelle and Linus Sandgren. We love Linus. Apparently, something clicked when they worked together too, as they went on to make 2 more movies thus far together. I think the cinematographer-director duo is one of the most intense relationships on a film set, and really anywhere for that matter. These two, during La La Land, absolutely chefed it up in there. My favorite scene from a cinematography perspective is the tap dancing scene overlooking LA. I just love the story behind the scene, how they essentially had a 20-minute window over a couple of days to actually capture it when the light was correct. The camera move is relatively complex, and the shot being fairly long, with both performers needing to be at their best in tandem, really crazy impressive. I also love watching the behind-the-scenes clip of the techno crane operator operating throughout the shot. Not to mention the light. This moment where they are both coming together as one for the first time in the film, and the sky is this lovely purple hue. This exemplifies his color theory in the film, where Gosling's character wears a lot of red leading up, while Stone's character wears a lot of blue. And then you combine the blue and the red and you get purple. And this is like their first real moment together. It's really lovely. I also just want to mention some camera moves that Chazelle continues to come back to throughout all of his films. I love the idea of a signature shot in a director. For Chazelle, it is the crash in or out of the bell of a trumpet. And, of course, his signature whip pans. Who could forget? What Damien Chazelle makes next is kind of unexpected, because up to this point he just makes these movies about music, but then he gets called up to direct First Man, which is such a different film than La La Land and Whiplash. First time Chazelle isn't making a movie explicitly about music, but he chose to have Linus back, which I think really speaks to their relationship, because this movie looks so good, but in a way completely different to La La Land and Whiplash. I would compare it more to Whiplash than La La Land, actually, even though the same dude shot both La La Land and First Man, just because of the realism in it, right? But this being a historical sort of biopic about real things that actually happened completely removes this from his other filmography. Obviously, La La Land is a cool, stylistic, literal musical, and Whiplash is loosely based around his own experiences being in bands growing up. But then a movie about Armstrong? What? What's especially fascinating about the cinematography of this film is how Linus and Chazelle chose to shoot most of it on Super 16, which is so fun because it's such a fun format. Just this like tiny little piece of film capturing, you spend millions of dollars on a movie and you shoot it on Super 16. It's such a choice. I love it. All of these emotional moments, whether it be with the Armstrong family or in the capsule, were shot on Super 16. The grain and the grit and the texture of that format really elevates these moments in a beautiful, timeless way. But then they intercut those moments with stuff shot in IMAX. You don't have a larger leap in perceived resolution. The size of a piece of IMAX film compared to a piece of Super 16 film, I'll have it on the screen, It's insane. The amount of light that IMAX film captures compared to the tiny amount of light that Super 16 film captures, they're on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. But the most interesting and clever thing to me is how Linus chose to shoot all of the moon parts on the same lenses they used to actually take the photos on the moon. They also decided to shoot those moments outdoors at a rock quarry at night. Some moments, even in the BTS, look like they could have actually been shot on the moon, which is largely due to the quality of light. This huge single source that Linus puts up, it's so simple. The huge single source that is the sun while on the moon is something that is very difficult to replicate on Earth. I found an interview with Linus on filmmakermagazine.com where he goes into a little bit more detail about the whole process. Definitely a good read if you're interested, so I'll link it in the description. But for this specific scene, Linus used only one huge source. He asked the developer of the soft sunlight, David Pringle, to create a 200,000 watt bulb. Linus said that the 100,000 watt soft sun wasn't nearly bright enough, and because using multiple 100Ks would create strange shadows everywhere, essentially ruining the shot, it just needed to be a brighter bulb. They had 2 of these 200,000 watt bulbs made, and one blew up on the first day of shooting because it just got so hot so fast. So they needed to use the next bulb more sparingly, dimming it down between takes so it wouldn't get too hot. This level of filmmaking is something us mere mortals can only aspire to be a part of one day. There were also some other inherent issues with shooting the moonwalk scene outdoors at night. It actually snowed right before they were supposed to start shooting, so they had to get rakes and big heaters and melt and sweep all the snow away before they could start. It's not like you can just delay a night shoot when you have Ryan Gosling on set, so they just made it happen. Something else I really want to discuss is the landing scene right before they are actually on the moon. They shot a lot of this on a volume wall, which is the perfect use case for this technology. The Super 16 film with all of its beautiful grain and texture, and then only shooting the actual screen when it's in the background through those windows is the perfect example of how to use this, where you're using the grain and texture to hide the fact that it's not real. It just adds all these lovely reflections on the windows of the capsule as well as the visors of the astronaut's helmet. It's really just the perfect use of this newish technology, which I feel sometimes gets overused in situations which are not ideal. Then, when it gets overused, sometimes, you don't get all the shots in camera, and then you need to replace the whole background anyways, which significantly detracts from the appeal of shooting on this expensive technology. But back to the thesis of this video, Chazelle, even though he's making a very different movie than La La Land, brought Linus back. Once a DP learns to read their director's mind, they can make themselves very difficult to replace. It is extremely valuable to a director having a DP who can really read their mind and not even need to communicate until it is absolutely necessary. Alright, moving on from First Man, Babylon is a significantly more Chazellian film. Babylon feels like a movie you get when someone who's in love with Hollywood is given a lot of money and not a lot of restrictions. This film is a little nuts, and I really enjoy a lot of it. I have my qualms with the back half, like most people do, but not as much as some people. I think the first act is so incredibly insane that it's just so hard to keep pace with that first act. It's like one of my favorites ever put to film. It's just so full of energy and production value. I don't know, I had a great time watching it. But looking at this movie from the perspective of cinematography is an absolutely fascinating film. Linus, back again for the third feature with Chazelle, shot 4% Kodak negative, mostly with anamorphics, which is like such a timeless and expensive look.
Here's the twist.
But the most fascinating part to me is how Linus shot the daytime exteriors. He overexposed the film about 3 to 4 stops and then pushed it in development. Now, obviously, I'm sure there's more magic going on in post to make this look this good, but it's like such a distinct image and it feels so intentional for this. And you just feel like you're in a hot desert in LA making movies in the 20s. It's lovely. Something I absolutely agree with, though, is the concept of doing everything in camera, or at least as much as possible. There are some really fascinating, huge scenes in this film that are captured in camera, like they used to do in the good old days, and that's really cool. The whole concept of using these old ways of doing things to capture this movie that is set in the 20s, it all comes together as this fascinating, flawed love letter to old Hollywood, while still showing its flaws, right? Like, obviously, old Hollywood is so flawed, and they do such a great job showing this in this film. I really wish Babylon would have performed better at the box office, as I would love to see a $100 million Chazelle film just to see what he does with that kind of money, because it's such a fascinating career, right? From Whiplash on a $3.3 million budget, but it grosses well over 10 times that, and then fast forward all the way to an $80 million box office flop. I'm fascinated to see what he makes next and what he's allowed to make next, right? I don't see a studio giving him that amount of money again, but who knows? Maybe they do. I don't know how that stuff works. I really truly respect Chazelle as a filmmaker, though. I respect his commitment to shooting on film and doing as much as you can in camera. I'm fascinated by his seemingly winding search for a cinematographer before he landed on Linus. I wonder how much of that decision depended on who he had access to versus who he could actually get or pay for, you know? Like, Linus was relatively established at the time. Or I wonder if he, met him at some event or screening or the Oscars or what have you, and then they really just hit it off on a social sense. It's like all this mysterious Hollywood networking that goes on behind the scenes that none of us hear about and no one really knows about except for the people involved. Fascinated by that. But I wonder if he had his eyes on Linus well before, but couldn't get him as a no-name director. Who knows? Then, with the Whiplash success, he capitalized. Speaking of capitalizing, I think it's really impressive how Chazelle has grabbed every opportunity presented to him. He has really made his movies and doesn't seem to bow to the big studio. I'm sure there are concessions made at some point in the process, but he seemingly just does things his way, and you've got to respect that, especially from a relatively young director. Chazelle's next film is yet to be officially confirmed, and I would imagine Linus would be brought on for a fourth collaboration, but grain of salt, obviously. What makes Chazelle truly remarkable is his understanding that cinematography isn't just about beautiful shots. Obviously, his films are chock full of beautiful shots, but he understands that it's about storytelling. His career is one to certainly be inspired by. He sort of catapulted himself into making the movies he wanted to as fast as humanly possible. Not impressive. I hope you've enjoyed this disjointed ramble, and have a good day. Bye-bye.